You have never worn a uniform that changed who you are, or so you think. Put on a police jacket, a referee's stripes, a nurse's scrubs, and something shifts in your posture before you even notice it. Your voice drops, your shoulders square. You start acting like the clothes expect you to. In 1971, a psychologist wanted to know exactly how far that shift could go. Not an inch, not a posture change. He wanted to know if a costume and a room could turn an ordinary, kind, checked out of society college student into someone capable of cruelty. The answer terrified him. Picture the basement of a university building in Palo Alto, California. No windows, no natural light. Cinder block walls painted over to look like cell bars. A psychologist named Philip Zimbardo had turned it into a mock prison, and he filled it with 24 young men who had answered a newspaper ad promising $15 a day for a study on prison life. They were screened for good mental health, no history of violence, no criminal record. By every measure, ordinary people. Half were randomly assigned to be guards, half to be prisoners. A coin flip decided who held power and who didn't. Within 36 hours, one prisoner was sobbing uncontrollably, screaming that he couldn't take it anymore. Within a few days, guards were forcing prisoners to do push-ups with a fellow inmate sitting on their back. They stripped prisoners naked as punishment. They took away mattresses. They woke inmates at 2 in the morning for head counts that served no purpose except to remind them who was in charge. The experiment was supposed to run for 2 weeks. It was shut down after 6 days. Here is the part that made this study famous, and the part you have probably heard before if you've ever taken a psychology class. Zimbardo argued that the roles themselves were the cause. Not bad people, not bad genes. Just a role, a uniform, and a system that told ordinary people what kind of person to become. He called it the Lucifer effect, after the idea that even an angel can fall if the situation pulls hard enough. For decades, that was the story. The lesson was simple, and it was frightening precisely because it was simple. You are not as far from cruelty as you think. Give you a badge, a hierarchy, and permission, and the line between decent and dangerous gets thinner than you'd like to believe. But here's what almost nobody tells you about that basement in Palo Alto. Years later, journalists and historians got access to the original audio recordings from the experiment. What they found complicated the whole story. Zimbardo himself, they discovered, wasn't a neutral observer. He was actively coaching the guards. In one recording, he can be heard telling a guard to be tough, to make the prisoners feel like they had no control. A French sociologist named Thibault Letexier spent years digging through the archived files and audio in the 2010s. What he found was that some of the most dramatic guard behavior wasn't spontaneous cruelty bubbling up from an assigned role. It was performance, shaped by a researcher who wanted a specific outcome and nudged his subjects toward it. Even the prisoner who had the breakdown later admitted, decades on, that part of it was an act, a way to get out of an experiment he regretted joining. So was the whole thing fake? Not exactly. And that's the more interesting, more useful answer. Because around the same time as Zimbardo's basement, other psychologists were running very different experiments that pointed toward a similar, if messier, truth. Situations shape behavior more than most people want to admit, but people are not empty vessels who become whatever a room tells them to become. Muzafer Sherif's Robbers Cave experiment from 1954. He split 22 boys at a summer camp in Oklahoma into 2 groups without telling them about each other. Once each group had bonded, he introduced competition, tug-of-war, baseball, a shared pool of prizes. Within days, name-calling turned into flag-burning, turned into raids on each other's cabins. Ordinary 11-year-old boys, sorted into an us and a them, escalated into hostility that surprised even the researchers. Then, when Sherif had the 2 groups work together on shared problems, a truck that needed everyone to push, a water supply that needed everyone's help, the hostility dissolved almost as fast as it had appeared. That's the piece Zimbardo's basement experiment often leaves out. Group identity, not just individual role-playing, drives behavior, and that identity can be built up or broken down depending on what a situation asks of you. 10 years earlier, in 1961, a psychologist named Stanley Milgram ran an experiment that didn't need a fake prison at all. He asked ordinary volunteers, again screened for normal mental health, to sit at a control panel and deliver what they believed were increasingly painful electric shocks to another person whenever that person got a memory question wrong. The shocks weren't real. The other person was an actor, but the volunteers didn't know that. A man in a lab coat stood behind them, calmly saying, "The experiment requires that you continue," each time they hesitated. More than 60% of participants delivered what they believed was the maximum shock, 450 volts, enough to kill, not because they were cruel, because a man in a lab coat, a clipboard, and an institutional setting told them it was fine. You'd like to believe you'd have refused. Most people do. Most people are wrong about that. So here is where the twist actually lands, and it's stranger than anyone can become a monster. The real finding, once you strip away the theatrics of a staged prison basement, is this: cruelty rarely announces itself as cruelty. It arrives wearing the costume of duty, of following orders, of just doing your job, of the situation required it. Zimbardo's basement was partly manufactured drama, but Milgram's shockbox wasn't staged the same way, and Sherif's summer camp boys weren't coached to hate each other. Across all three, a pattern holds even after you throw out the shakiest data. Authority, uniforms, and group identity change what feels acceptable to do. Not because people flip a switch into evil, because the situation quietly moves the line of what counts as normal. Think about the last time you wore a name tag at a job that gave you a script to follow. Think about the last time you were part of an online group, anonymous behind a username, and said something you'd never say to someone's face at a dinner table. That's not a coincidence. That's the same mechanism, running at a much smaller, much more everyday scale. Anonymity does something specific to behavior. Researchers who study what's called Deindividuation, the process of losing your sense of individual identity inside a group or behind a screen, have found again and again that people become more willing to act against their own stated values when they feel unseen. A comment section is a costume. A username is a role. A pile-on is a summer camp raid with worse Wi-Fi. You do this too, not because you're secretly cruel, because the architecture of the situation, the anonymity, the crowd, the sense that everyone else is doing it, lowers the cost of doing it too. Here's the useful part though. If situations can push you toward cruelty, they can also be redesigned to pull you away from it. Sherif didn't fix his warring campers with a lecture on kindness. He gave them a shared goal that required cooperation, and the hostility dissolved because the structure of the situation changed, not because anyone's heart did. That's the actual lesson hiding under 6 decades of dramatic headlines. Character matters less than architecture. The rules of a room, the presence or absence of accountability, whether you're seen as an individual or hidden inside a crowd, these shape behavior more reliably than most people's sense of their own goodness ever will. It's uncomfortable to sit with that. It's more comforting to believe cruelty belongs to a specific kind of person, someone unlike you, someone you'd recognize walking toward you on the street. But the boys at summer camp weren't recognizable as future enemies until day 3. The volunteers with the shock generator weren't recognizable as people capable of delivering 450 volts until a man in a lab coat gave them permission. And the guards in that basement, coached or not, were college students who, a week earlier, were worried about exams. So the next time you put on a uniform, a name tag, a job title, a username, ask yourself a smaller, more honest question than, "Am I a good person?" Ask what the room is asking of you. Ask who's watching and who isn't. You. Ask what you'd do if the only person who'd ever find out was you. Because you were never as far from that basement as you thought. You just never noticed the uniform you were already wearing.